Hey everybody, this is Alex Merced from AlexMercedCoder.dev, and in this video what I want to do is talk about dynamic HTML in the sense that right now we've talked about serving static files. So you're just delivering an HTML file, you're delivering a CSS file, and it's already pre-written. So it's always going to say the same thing, and that's fine and good, and that's great for the most basic of like front-end static sites. But what's going to happen is that sites become more dynamic, where depending on like different users are going to see different things on the screen. So the idea is you need to kind of like dynamically modify that page on the fly. So what I want to do in today's video is to show you kind of like how dynamic HTML generation kind of works. So bottom line is first, let's just talk about what's called a templating language. So there are several templating languages out there. So one popular one for like when you're working with JavaScript is called EJS. So let's look up EJS, embeddable JavaScript. And essentially the idea is what you're doing is you're pre-processing files. So what you're doing is you're creating what looks like an HTML file with some special syntax, in this case EJS. Okay, let me just see if they have a sample here. So you see it would look like an HTML file. So it looks like you're writing HTML, but then you're able to put in these like special like syntax in there. And what's going to happen is that on our server will process that syntax before it sends out the final HTML to the client. So essentially what you're doing is kind of like it's kind of like Mad Libs, where basically you're writing a Mad Lib and then you're telling it, hey, this is the HTML file, but it's not complete. Can you finish it before you send it to the user? Okay, so we're creating a template for the HTML file we're going to send to the user with information that needs to be filled in first. And the templating language basically is the syntax we use for basically expressing those things that need to be done first. That stuff that has to be pre-processed. So EJS basically relies on a very JavaScript-like syntax. So basically, if you already know JavaScript, it's essentially like you writing JavaScript to express how you want your HTML file to be organized. Okay, this makes it one of the easier ones to pick up. But there are other ones. So there's like Pug. Okay, let's show you like a version of like Pug. So like a Pug template would look something like, would look something like this. So you see like you express, you actually literally don't even bother writing HTML. You write it in its own special syntax. So you see here I'm saying it's a p tag. Okay, inject this variable. So that's the variable I'm injecting. And then here's some text inside the p tag. Okay, it ends up looking a bit different. So it does take a little getting used to, but some people like it because instead of having to write like P and then a closing tag P, I can just write P once without the angle brackets, and I end up saving myself a lot of keystrokes. So that's like one that's pretty popular. Liquid.js. This is actually, Liquid is a templating language that was created by Shopify. I think it started out with like as a Ruby templating language, but here's like a JavaScript implementation. And just to show you an example of how that one looks like, let me see like some examples. So you see it doesn't look too far from EJS, but it's going to be a little bit more Ruby-ish type syntax. But yeah, so you see like you're just expressing different programs like if statements, whatnot, in that syntax. Again, generally all these templating languages, they kind of do the same thing. So whichever one you end up using, it doesn't really make too much of a difference. Like there's handlebars, okay, handlebars JS, handlebars, everything is basically, let's get started. Show you, so this is basically what it looks like when you're using handlebars. So you see inject variables using like double curly brackets. Um, there's also another one, mustache, which is pretty much the same thing. Okay. Mustache basically just lets you inject variables, doesn't have any logic. So that's the difference between like handlebars and mustache. So if all you really need to do is inject variables, then mustache. But if you want to get the extra like if statements and loops in your HTML, then you can use handlebars, or you can use EJS, or you can use Pug. I'm trying to think if there's any other ones. There's a lot of them. Like if you go to npm, so if we go to npm here and type in like templating, we'll say like Express, because generally you always want one that's kind of already built to work with Express. It just makes it easier to use because it already has like, it's already built with that kind of functionality in it. But we type in Express templates, you can see like there's Express handlebars. Um, this is like, apparently this is something for like something called a Dust.js template. Let's see if they have an example of that. Do you have an example of a template? No, doesn't show me an example. Okay, something to look up another day. That sounds interesting. But you can see like there's a bunch of flexible handlebars view engine, Swig templates is another one that's kind of popular. So you can see an example of Swig. Again, doesn't look too different than like Liquid. Bottom line, there's a lot of these different types of template languages. Okay, and all they are is to express logic in your HTML that gets pre-processed. So basically, at the end of the day, the browser has no idea what EJS or Pug or whatnot is. The browser is just going to get HTML, but that HTML is created on your server by your server application. That's essentially what's happening here. So it allows you to do some more exciting stuff with your HTML. So now that we've kind of established that, we'll work with EJS. EJS is definitely the easiest to kind of get started with. Okay, so what we need to do is I'm going to stop my server. So Control C to stop the server. And what I need to do is install EJS. So you do npm install EJS. Again, make sure that you're in the project folder. So I install EJS, and again, we can always confirm that EJS was installed by I can see it in my package.json. So you got installed, and I can see that it's there. Cool. And actually, the cool thing about EJS is that you don't even actually have to even really do anything. I don't have to actually like write anything in my code to use it. I can just start using it right out of the gate. So watch. So basically, what you want to do is by default, the way that Express configures using templates is that it's going to assume that you're going to have a folder called views. Again, it has to be inside your project folder. So in my project folder, I create a folder called views, and that's going to be where it looks for templates. Okay. So let's create a route that serves a template. So we'll say app.get whenever we go to /template. Okay. We'll do a thing. And we're going to say request response. Okay, and instead of sending a response, what you do is you're going to use this function called res.render. Okay, and what res.render does, it tells Express that it's going to use a templating engine. Okay, and by default, if you do no configuration, I'm not going to get into how you would configure it right now. What it's going to do is going to be basing it on the file extension. So since we're using EJS, our files need to be .ejs files, and that'll tell it, oh, okay, use the EJS library to process this thing. Okay, so I'm going to say, hey, I'm going to expect that there's going to be a file called, first template or first.ejs. And that's going to be inside the views folder. Again, this is always going to expect it in the context of the views folder. Okay, and so let's do that first. So let's go inside views and create a file called first.ejs. Okay, and the way it works, EJS works, is you can have HTML, just like you just write normal HTML, like hello, but you can inject like JavaScript logic. So the way you do that is you would use this syntax here. So you would use like this kind of syntax that represents like a command, and then I can actually put JavaScript in here. So I can say, for, and then write a loop like for let I equal 0. We'll just say as long as I is less than 3. And on each loop, we'll increment I. And then again, we need to do the open curly bracket for the loop. And then we need to put the closing curly bracket for the loop over here. And you see like that's essentially like the loop right there. Okay. And then anytime I go outside of these, I'm back in HTML. So basically what it's going to do, it's going to loop over this 3 times and create 3 H1s. That's essentially what EJS is going to do. So I'm basically telling it, so when the EJS engine renders this EJS file, it'll generate that. So let's just actually try that out. So let's do npm run dev to run with Notamon. Okay, so let's go to localhost 3000/template. And see, I got 3 H1s. See, I didn't write the H1 hello 3 times, but because with EJS, I was able to express logic So that way I don't have to do it like 3 times. Okay, so now for example, where this becomes really useful is when you're working with like data. Okay, so you may have data in a database. So if I go back to my server.js, as a second argument to this render function, so as a second argument to this render function, I can pass in a object. And this object can have any data that I want to use in this template. So I'm going to just create an array. So we'll have a property called nums. And this nums property will just literally be an array of 3 numbers or 4 numbers. Okay. So the key that I choose to name the value in the object is going to determine how I refer to it in the template. And then this is what the value of that is going to be. So now what I can do is if I can go back to that EJS file, instead of doing a for loop like this, I could do a for of loop. So I can be like for like let num of nums. And again, where is it getting this nums from? It's getting nums from the object that I passed in here. Okay, so this is like, oh, look, there's a nums property. And nums equals an array. So I can like loop over that array. So I can go loop nums over nums. So now on each loop, num is going to represent that one value in the array. So I can go in here, and then what I can do is I can inject the value. So now look at the slight difference in how I do this. Notice I'm inputting this equal sign here. Whenever you want to inject text into the HTML, you use the equal sign. That means take whatever is inside these EJS brackets, and sometimes you might refer to them as like squids. See, that kind of look like a squid from like Mario. And inject num. So I'm saying, hey, whatever the value is of num should go in here in the h1. So now watch what happens when I refresh this page. See, I get 1, 2, 3, 4. Because it looped over the array and it created an h1 for each number. So imagine you have like a list of users or a list of movies or a list of things. Instead of having to create like an h1 for each thing, I can pre-generate the HTML from the server side. Okay, so that way when the user gets the page already has like the list of movies. So again, we're pre-generating the HTML. This is kind of like what people used to do with like PHP. Like if you ever use WordPress, that's kind of how WordPress works, except it's using like PHP templates. Okay, so that's essentially what EJS does. It allows us to express. It allows us to sit there and pre-generate fancy HTML files. And there's a lot you can do with EJS. You can actually like spread it across multiple files, create what's called a partial. So that way you can actually have reusable pieces of HTML. There's a lot of really cool stuff you can do with here as you get more advanced using EJS. But again, EJS allows you to dynamically generate that HTML using JavaScript logic. Okay, and to kind of learn the syntax, you would just again read the EJS documentation. But essentially, like whatever you can do in JavaScript, you can do in EJS. That's all it is. It's just JavaScript. Okay. Yeah. So again, there's a lot of things you can do within your server file to kind of express what you want to happen. So again, let me just label this. Set up a static file serving. That's what that line does. Okay, here what we're doing is we're going to render an EJS template. And that's kind of where we are so far. And again, you can find this code if you look inside the video description. There's a link. And then you just find the folder that says Express 2022, and you should find the code that we've built here so far. Okay, so I'll see y'all in the next video. Have a great day.